I can remember covering for a driver and this elderly lady saying, "I'm not handicapped, I'm just old." And I'm saying, "Ma'am, you're 99 years old. It's perfectly fine for you to get on the bus. I'm happy to be here. This is just a ride to your doctor." And she sort of seemed a little bit better on that.
Welcome to the Accessible Future podcast. I'm Simon Jones, your host, and our guest today is Paul Siller. I've personally known Paul for quite a few years. He is the executive director of the Rocky View Regional Handibus Society. They're a rural non-profit organization that helps people get where they need to go, whether that's medical appointments, dialysis, groceries, or just the next town over. There's a moment in our conversation when he told me about a phone call that he had. A new mother stranded in town without a vehicle and no way to get her baby to its vaccinations. It made him rethink what a transportation barrier actually is, and it led to them changing their whole philosophy. We got into language, stigma, and why Paul sees transportation as a foundation of health. I think you'll really enjoy this one, so let's get into it. Good afternoon, Paul. How are you doing today?
It's a fine Friday afternoon.
It's good. So tell us a little bit about your role there as being the executive director at the Rocky View Handibus Society.
Well, I have a desk plate that says something about fixer of everything. So I get to do everything. Maybe it's better to explain what we do.
Mm-hmm.
We're a rural charity that does community transportation. We started out as the classic small town handy bus kind of venture back in 1980 of all places.
Mm-hmm.
Group of families with special needs kids, and I got involved in 2000, and we now do 5 municipalities in a region around Calgary. Rocky View County is the big one, town of Cochrane, city of Chestermere, town of Crossfield, village of Bicyker, our partners, they all contribute to fund the organization, and, somehow we managed to get I say a bare bones community transit program going for this area of like 4,500 square kilometers, helping people stay in their home a little longer. It's about focusing on people with transportation barriers. Because of our limited funding, we're just weekdays. We have a limit of how many trips you can take in a month.
Yep.
But it's ideally enough that someone who has a major health issue or is trying to stay in her home a little longer
Mm-hmm.
before having to move into a care center can get to groceries, can get to medical appointments, major stuff too, such as dialysis, chemo, cataract surgery. All those are in nearby Calgary, but other things are just next town over. What we do really weird or differently is because we work with 5, 6 municipalities, we can pick up in municipality A, going to the Foothills Hospital, and then pick up in municipality B, going to the Lougheed Hospital, drop one off, drop another one, go to municipality C, bring someone into Calgary, and then find that the first person's ready to go home, and then take them home. So we've managed 4 trips from 3 municipalities, but with 1 bus. And somehow we manage some 15,000 trips a year, averaging almost 30 kilometers. And as opposed to executive director, I guess I'm the person who finds the money, finds the people to make this all work, and then solves a lot of problems along the way.
So it sounds a very diverse role and extremely diverse in the work that you do. So a couple of fun facts for our viewers then. Do you know how many kilometers your vehicles would do in a year?
In 2025, we did 600,000 kilometers.
Wow. That's a lot of kilometers.
And I mean, it was so close to $600,000 for all intents and purposes.
Yeah.
It's 600,000.
So how many rides would you do in a year?
About 15,000 at the moment.
That's incredible. Well, I was reading up something before we joined here, and did you turn down this job to begin with?
Well, I think I remember a quote: "Life is what happens while you're making other plans." My background's outdoor education. Put myself to university, doing all this wilderness stuff. Decided I would change my career to something stable. I had to get a student loan. It didn't quite work out. I ended up with Calgary Handibus Association as a driver, to pay off my student loans. So my outdoor career gave me a background in nonprofits and grant writing. Driving for a disability agency gave me more driving experience. They said, "Oh, could you help us?" Well, I was still trying to do that career change, and I said no. And they came back and asked again, and I said no. And they came back after 2 more weeks and said, "Our executive director has walked out. Could you help us part time just until Christmas?" And that was supposed to be like 3.5 months. And that was 24 years ago. And since then, I've found this puzzle I can't put down: how to get people to where they need to go, how to do it with, I'll say, a fixed income. That's the world of a nonprofit. And, um, and how to grow the organization. When I started, we had 5 vehicles. Now we have 18. So it's been this ongoing obsession with a puzzle.
So thank you for sharing that, Paul. So this podcast is all about what an accessible future looks like. So can you tell us in your own words, what does an accessible future look like and what barriers need to be removed to get there?
Most people have no inkling of what barriers
Mm-hmm.
are right in front of us until someone in their family can't see the front door, can't go down 3 steps.
Yep.
And then all of a sudden it becomes, oh, why didn't we think of this before? And sadly, every family has to learn this, and it's really impossible to pass this information down. What I find is that it's still the everyday things that are a barrier. People call and say, "Okay, can you help with this? And can you do this?" And so forth. And then we find out, on the first time we get to meet this family, we discover they still have 5 stairs, and the mother in law is in using a wheelchair. And you politely try to ask, "How did you get them in?" "Oh, I just carried her up." Well, that's not really a long-term solution, is it? We had one fellow that couldn't get into a bank in the town of Cochrane because his wheelchair was too wide, and they couldn't. It was a single door. It was a slightly above average width for it, but not nothing. We got it on the bus, so it can't be that horrible. So, what does accessibility look like? It looks like having facilities and everyday stores able to accommodate different sizes of people and mobility devices. It also has the ability to for these services to be closer to home. We've
Yeah.
made progress on that one. Before the pandemic, I remember taking a lady to into Calgary because an agency in Calgary organized all the rent subsidy applications. Everything else could be done local, but this had to be done in Calgary in person. But since the pandemic, we all learned about how to video conference. Things have gotten a bit better. There's a bit more outreach into places,
Mm-hmm.
but the Calgary region's still centered heavily on the specialists and the hospitals all being downtown. I mean, there's 10 communities around Calgary, but in those 10 communities, there's 0 hospitals. So accessibility, it looks like something has been planned, and looks like got to put the services where the people are. And then the last part is the supports, the foundations that get people to those services and supports are there. Alberta has no provincial funding for transit. So every municipality decides what they're going to do, if they're going to do it, and to what extent they'll do. I think one of the challenges is that because no one's imposed a standard, a Abilities Act, or even recognize that for every dollar Rocky View Regional Handibus Society spends on transportation, the province saves like $7 in healthcare costs. We seem to be always pushing against people who are basically feeling that this isn't my problem at the moment. So maybe accessibility also means that people are just a little bit more aware of a bigger picture and take a thought or two ahead so that when they build something, they don't put 7 stairs on it.
When you were talking about that, it reminded me this morning I was working with a client here in Manitoba, and we were actually looking at the regulations around what they consider someone in a wheelchair to be. This is for licensing now, and they
Mhm.
consider it to be 4 people in a van or a wheelchair accessible vehicle. So we were saying, okay, well, so if you're going to do 4 passengers plus, say, 2 or 3 wheelchairs, you're up to 18 people. And so therefore you've got to go to a class 4. And she was like scratching her head because she's like, this seems ridiculous why they would consider someone in a wheelchair as 4 positions in a vehicle. I don't know if you've ever heard of that.
I have heard of something similar to that, because there's the same inspection routine that truckers do happens if you've got 10, 11 people in the vehicle. And so 2 wheelchairs is now 8 plus a driver. So now all of a sudden you are in that category of different record keeping and so forth. And you're looking at a van that has seats for 3 ambulatory people, the driver, and 2 spaces for a wheelchair, and yes, now we're at easily at, quote, 12.
Yeah.
One person did mention it's about weight, but, it is kind of odd that it's by the space that imaginary people would have sat in
Yeah.
if the wheelchair wasn't there and
Yep.
seats had been put in. Who knew imaginary people would weigh that much? So
I know. I know. And she was saying to me, just like, all I want to do is transport somebody from A to B.
mhm.
That's all I want to do is transport an individual in a wheelchair for our care home. And I get faced with all these regulations that I've got to comply with. She said it seems ridiculous.
And we have all these departments not talking to each other, which of course, or not even considering accessibility.
Mhm.
So, someone in motor vehicles has said this is how it should be, not taking a look at a bigger picture for accessibility and why we see stairs or a door that's not. Or my favorite actually is a close friend of mine has a spinal cord injury, and
Mhm.
going out for dinner, we discover that, of course, uh, oh, yes, we have a wheelchair accessible washroom. We've learned still in this day and age to go check it out because you'll find that it was obviously designed by an architect and blueprinted by an engineer and built by a contractor, and an assistant yeoman carpenter did the finishing stuff, and the grab bar is in the wrong spot or a full meter away from the toilet, making it totally unusable unless we tie a rope to a passing cloud or the ceiling or something, for a handhold. Our shortfalls in accessibility are a lack of integration of the various specialties of building, providing healthcare, providing transportation,
Yeah.
and when we do combine them, neat synergies happen.
Mhm.
I remember some mall was upset about the idea of having to rip out stairs and put, in a ramp, and afterwards, I was pointing out to someone how they made such a fuss, but look at all the people not bothering with the stairs, but the ramp ended up being 3 meters wide. Everyone just walked up the gentle ramp as opposed to taking stairs, let alone the folks with, strollers and towing their groceries home and such.
Yeah. That brings me to my next question then. This is more around language and stigma, but you early on realized that the word handy transit itself was actually putting people off. And some writers, carried stigma from the old days of special school transport, I think is one of the things you've mentioned. So you started talking about the sort of the transportation barriers instead. And what really shifted when you changed the language? Can you tell us?
A lot of our seniors raised their families over the same course of 40 years that we've been existing. And our original name was the Crab Society for the Handicap, CRAB, Crossfield Rocky View Airdrie Balzac. It was purposely chosen back then to be catchy and flashy and such. And since they started more as a resource center and then the bus, that stuck. And in 2003, we changed it to Rocky View Regional Handibus Society. We then realized that the Rocky View Regional Handibus Society should be operating a program called the Rocky View Bus so that we could downplay the handicap. It apparently was originally the handy as in helpful.
Hmm.
Handyman, handy woman comes in, fixes your lights, your gutters, the broken step, but it's still a problem. So around 2002, I can remember covering for a driver and this elderly lady saying, "I'm not handicapped, I'm just old." And I'm saying, "Ma'am, you're 99 years old. It's perfectly fine for you to get on the bus. I'm happy to be here. This is just a ride to your doctor." And she sort of seemed a little bit better on that. When we changed it from the Crab Society for the Handicap to the Rocky View bus, people looked at us a lot differently. The name on the bus was kind of, I won't say inclusive. It was just not creating as much of a stigma. We had a lot of people over the years that would be interested in what we could do for their family, and then they would actually put it to mom or dad, and, "Oh, that's for people who really need a ride. I think we can survive without it, or as long as you son can keep taking days off from work to drive me to my appointments." So yes, part of this problem is that there are preconceptions of the word disability and handicap, and still some really rude words from dark ages that float around in everyday common use. It's a definition of accessibility really starts talking about passengers, not passengers with disabilities. It's all passengers. The stereotypes that pop into people's head
Mhm.
uh, become quite strange. Once upon a time, a heating, ventilation, air conditioning contractor was doing something for our shop and was looking at our bus, and he was very proudly telling me he would never hire someone with a disability because I won't hire any handicap. And it's like, it's 2015. This is not an us versus them, and yet people are still, "Oh, no," because, what would they be able to do? And it's weird to see people just turn away from possibilities of that someone might be able to provide something really good for an agency based on a label.
Yeah.
Truthfully, I've had able-bodied folks who were horrible employees. They didn't need a disability to be a horrible employee. They did it all on their own initiative. So,
So did you hire the contractor back?
I've been fortunate not to need that job repeated. So,
Good. That's fair. So you've also said it's not about disability, it's about people facing transportation barriers. So why does that distinction matter so much for whether someone will accept a ride?
I guess the reason we really thought about using that term was, we got a phone call from a small community. And, back in those days, we were so modeled after Winnipeg's Handy Transit that they had way back when, and it's an alternative to the fixed routes because every bus had 7 steps or 5 steps on there. So we were supposed to be about seniors and disability and such. So this woman phones, and her husband had moved her and her newborn to the smaller community,
Mhm.
and then immediately took the truck and went for 3 weeks, a 3 week stint working in Fort McMurray. There's a grocery store in this community. There's lots of things local and walking distance, but she had to get to the next town for her newborn vaccinations and such. And
Yeah.
we asked these questions: Are you elderly? No. Do you have a disability? No. And I said, "Well, with our what we do, we can't really help you." And after I hung up the phone, I realized that the very next day, we're going to be picking up in that small community at a house across the street and 3 doors down, coming into the health center for the seniors oriented adult day program. Why are we not finding a way to make some transportation available so that she could get her toddler immunized as she's kind of stuck in a small town and having to suddenly make friends
Mhm.
to drive the 15 kilometers to the next town. And that sort of created the why we talk about transportation barriers. Transportation barriers without a mobility or sensory impairment are maybe single digit percentage of some sort of the total stuff we do. But when we're in a rural area and there is no other options, then we need to figure out a way to have a framework that lets us help them without making it a complete change of mission or focus.
Yeah.
So that's how we came to use these words about transportation barriers, and we have been having a little bit of a challenge over the last 5 years as helping people with transportation barriers sometimes starts blending into the desire that from the community that, oh, you should be providing transportation to anybody who wants it. I don't want to pay for the gas to or the parking at the hospital or such. And that we're having a little bit of a screening problem of being able to make sure that the bus is available for the people who most need us. But there's no real cut and dry way of often identifying
Mhm.
each situation. But saying that we do people facing transportation barriers is our way of making it less about the disability and more about just the need for access to, again, sports and services available in the community needed to maintain independence.
Yeah. So how are you able to overcome those people that just want a ride?
Generally by and this is not intentional, but for a handy bus, we're not very handy. You gotta book 4 or 5 days in ahead for us
Mhm.
to figure out how to get you there. We get 2 10 o'clock appointments. Well, someone's gonna have to be dropped off early, and someone may have to stick around a little when there are a pair of 2 o'clock return appointments, and they're one side from the other in Calgary. And then finally, we our limit of 10 days of travel in a month, it starts steering us away from things like people who suddenly realize, hey, this would be a great way to get to work.
Mhm.
And we're still managing to not have to do heavy assessment of, do you have other options and what other options are available. So by the way we've ended up growing and as we've become busier, we're not as flexible. So a lot of people who do have other options still manage to take them, which is a horrible way to provide service. But by being self-limiting, we seem to get the people who really need us.
That's good. So that brings me to my next question. So you've talked about transportation being a foundation of health, and that no one really wants to pay attention to this. So what breaks in someone's life when that foundation isn't there?
The rationale I use explaining what we do is that if someone can't drive, it's not helpful. But if someone can't drive where there's no public transportation, that's getting really challenging. And that person ends up depending on so many other people for basics or assistance. And everyone's willing to pitch in for a little while. But as time progresses, it's harder to get those supports. And then the person loses independence, and then ends up having to move to somewhere, in the case of seniors, where they end up moving to a lodge in the next town. Or, we've got a senior taking care of her spouse with dementia. If she can have the
Mhm.
support to catch a ride so that she can keep her attention on him while someone drives, she can reduce her social isolation, actively contribute to the care of her spouse. And by being more independent, well, I don't really like putting it this way, but she doesn't feel that she's a burden.
Mhm.
She is not a burden, or dependent on other people just to survive every day. The other comment I make to people is this kind of transportation is like sidewalks. You never really notice whether or not the sidewalk is there or the quality of the sidewalk until you have to take the sidewalk.
Yep.
We're a car culture. And so when you can't drive yourself, then you start noticing the gaps like that.
That's good. So you once asked people to describe the situation in 25 words or less. There were things like, oh, my husband passed away and I never learned to drive. Why did those short stories do something a ridership number couldn't?
That exercise was really helpful in explaining to municipal councils,
Hmm.
because it's one thing to say that someone needs 10,000, 10,000,000 trips. It's another thing to start explaining why they need the the trips.
Yeah.
And what I found was that if you start showing that it's the little things we take for granted, then you start getting a little more buy-in or a little more understanding from council that is, well, really helpful in getting your funding organized. That question actually was really important when I was just trying to get municipalities to start contributing for this kind of thing. Until a family is faced with this kind of issue, every family's got too much on the go to actually start thinking what will happen down the road, or
Yeah.
they suddenly realize, hey, I need to walk on the sidewalk. Oh, there is no sidewalk. Hey, I need to take a community bus. Oh, there is no community bus. And as everyone relearns those lessons, the people who approve the policy directives also don't get a clue on it.
Hmm.
One of the funny things that happened, we suddenly got a lot of buy-in from municipalities when different elected officials started having to deal with their own parents suddenly losing their driver's license. Whether I remember someone mentioning about how his dad just passed away, his mom wasn't very good at driving, and then she just had a medical issue and lost her license in Northern Ontario. How is she going to get around? So all of a sudden, he starts sitting up a little more straight when making my pitch to council, and suddenly I'm getting a bit more interest instead of being, oh golly gee shucks, we're a rural community and we don't have money for that kind of stuff. Well, suddenly they start making money for that, available for that stuff.
Yeah. It's amazing how people's view changes eventually.
Mhm.
So we're almost out of time here, Paul. But one last question I wanted to ask you was, what's one thing you wish that every listener understood about the challenges of accessible transportation? What would that be?
I think most of my day to day challenges or frustrations are from the people who assume that just because they can hop in their car and drive to go get a prescription,
Mhm.
that we should just be able to hop in the bus, pick up mom, drive to the prescription, and run back. I try to explain it as, did your kids play hockey? Did you carpool? Share the driving. Well, when you started getting other kids from the team, you had to go east for 20 minutes and you had to go south for 20 minutes. And these are things that add to the time it takes to get to the rink, because people say 90 minutes to get to my eye appointment. That's ludicrous. Yes, well, we're traveling 35 kilometers and we're picking up a person and dropping them off along the way. Yes, effectively, it's doubling the time to go there directly. People don't take a breath and think, oh, it's a shared ride. Oh, we may have to detour. However, if you compare us to a transit system in any city, yes, you can get to your that pharmacy in 20 minutes by getting on this route, making a transfer and so forth. Might take 40 minutes or double. And it's not that we're slacking off. It's just that's the kind of timing that takes and resources it takes to get multiple people somewhere. If you want to go direct, call a cab. That's uh, probably the biggest ongoing discussion we have with passengers until they get it, that we're still getting you 40 kilometers to your doctor's appointment and you're not late. So
Or maybe this discussion will help them.
hopefully.
Well, that is all the time that we have today. We do really appreciate you coming on, Paul. Where can individuals, where can our viewers find you and find the Rocky View Regional Handibus Society?
Well, we have an ancient website that we've never really had the resources to update, but it's at www.rockyviewbus.ca. And there's some contact information on there and a few bits and pieces. We never bothered updating the website because we blow all our money driving people around. We're a little bit silly that way. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk. I get to talk about some things I think about, but never get to communicate to other people. So thanks.
No problem, Paul. It's great, and the service that you're doing is really helping people. It's really breaking down those barriers to transportation. Is there anything that you'd like to mention in regards to fundraising or volunteering or anything before we wrap up?
Just that we've grown to the size of organization with we've got paid drivers who are really the key that make it happen. Our biggest thing from passengers is that how wonderful the drivers are, and without the drivers, we wouldn't be able to do this. So, it's people on the street behind the wheel in any community that make this happen. And I'm not saying it's a special group of people, but if you're catching a ride with your local accessible agency, be it in small town or a big city, it's a certain type of driver that ends up appreciating and enjoying this kind of work. And if they've made your day possible by getting you to an appointment, I'll just let you in on the secret. You've probably made their day too by letting them give you a hand and those things you need to keep your independence. They're all the drivers are pretty good.
Oh, that's good. Well, make sure you pass on a big thank you to the drivers.
We will.
Right. Thank you, Paul. Thanks again for coming on. And that is our episode with Paul Siller. I really enjoyed his point about this transportation is like a sidewalk. You don't realize it's there or how good it is until you actually need it. And eventually, we all need it, whether it's for ourselves or our loved ones. Thank you again for coming on, Paul. And to all of our loyal listeners, we'll see you on the next one. If you're enjoying the Accessible Future podcast, make sure you subscribe and leave us a rating. You can follow us on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, wherever you're listening from. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, or LinkedIn, and let's build an accessible future together.